Hi, and welcome to another episode of When I Grow Up, the podcast on a quest to uncover and celebrate unique paths to fulfillment and joy in our work lives. Today we're chatting to Heather Orton, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. Heather has a very impressive CV, which includes working for companies like Accenture, KPMG, British Telecom, and the British royal family-sponsored startup, the Sustainable Markets Initiative. She is currently leading strategy for EY-Parthenon across Africa. I met Heather in 2016 when we both worked for Accenture in Europe. She was with the UK office at the time, and I was with the Amsterdam office. And two things immediately stood out the day that I met Heather. The first was that I was just so impressed and proud and very excited to see a South African woman leader doing so well in Europe and taking on the complex project that we were working on with such confidence, and it seemed almost within her stride. The second was the very kind and human approach that she brought to the role. You could see immediately when she started interacting with the team, not only in the Netherlands, but in the offices across the globe and India, for example, that she approached each person with a lot of respect as an individual and so much kindness in every interaction. And I just absolutely loved that. And so I was just so excited that she agreed to come on this podcast to share a little bit more about her journey, what she's learned along the way, and how we can all be more confident and authentic in our careers. Hi, Heather. Welcome to When I Grow Up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
We worked together, that was like 2016, 17 on a project in the Netherlands. So that's already ages ago. But, what really stuck with me about you and why I also wanted to get you on the podcast is that you had this really exceptionally, I don't want to call it like a human approach. I wish I had a better word for it, but just like a kindness radiating from you and the way that you were interacting with the team.
No, it was interesting when you dropped me the note, because I think you said in your note kind of reflecting on your journey. And I suppose for me, it's always been really interesting because I've never found it hard to put the human in what I do. But I suppose I realized through my career that it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. And I remember when I was at KPMG, actually, so after we worked together, I was made the people partner. So, and actually I ended up being the people partner during the COVID year. So I was responsible for over 1,000 people during, quite a mentally challenging year for, I think, everyone. And I remember one of my partners said to me, she said, yeah, but you think this comes naturally. It does to you. It doesn't to others. Like, you have to coach us to be better. And what I realized, because I've been doing a sort of lot of self-reflection, is that it actually ties back to my upbringing. So I was unfortunately, the child of an alcoholic father and a depressed mom. And what happened is, as a child, I became very hyper-aware and hyper-vigilant. And so my core focus was making sure that everybody was okay. And I suppose at the time I didn't realize that would then translate into a superpower.
What else in your upbringing shaped your ideas about career?
Oh, it's a complex question, and there's so many thoughts that kind of come to mind. So maybe I'll stick to the kind of three things that popped into my head initially. So the first thing was that we moved around a lot. My dad never spent longer than sort of 2 years in a role. And we, I think when I was 6 weeks old, we moved to Botswana and I had 6 primary schools. And so again, what turned into a superpower is my ability to create connections in a very short space of time. Because as you can imagine, in your formative years, it's important to feel like you fit in. It's important to have friends. And so I got very good at sort of making personal connections quite quickly. And I think that, in my career, that's really helped, because most of my career moves have been based on relationship. They haven't actually been based on sort of applying for formal roles. I've been able to use my network and my relationships to kind of create roles that make sense for me. The second one was really around because my dad never held down a job, and because, we never really had a home that we could call our own, because we were constantly moving. I think one of my big ambitions was to own my own property. It was very important for me to have that security of knowing that I owned somewhere that would always be mine, and that I wouldn't have to leave unless it was my choice. It was very important for me to define success in a certain way. And that was that sort of financial security, stability, that type of thing. And then the last one I think is really around, my mom was very good at coaching me around, if you put your mind to it, you can do it. Like nothing really is impossible. And I think that really stood me in good stead, because not only did I believe that I could do anything, but I often picked up projects that people told me couldn't be done. And, I found a way. And I think, the project we worked on together was a point in that. When I joined, it was in complete frustration. The client didn't want to work with us anymore. And I was like, no, we can fix this. If we just apply the right things, we'll get it right. So I think those are kind of the three things that have really helped me as I've sort of charted my career.
What I was thinking as you were speaking about, also that like tremendous amount of change, earlier in your life, I could see that kind of playing out in the complexity of the projects you took on, because at the time, of course, it was the kindness and the human approach, but it made it extra special that it was amidst this like extremely complex, project.
It's interesting because I always get feedback that I'm always calm in a storm. And I think a lot of friends and colleagues are amazed with how much I get done, because I think back then I was still working a 4-day week. So I was doing all of that in 4 days. One of my mentors once said to me, Heather, imagine you've only got 3 days in a week to get stuff done. What would be the things that you need to get done to add value and to move the program forward? And I think that's kind of stuck with me. So at the beginning of each week, I'm always like sort of mentally conscious, like what are the important things that I need to get done in order to move forward? And then everything else is noise. And I think that's always really helped me kind of, make sure that I am calm in a storm.
I just wanted to go briefly back to what you've said about the relationships and about how, that's kind of been how you've gotten, each of your different roles. If you can maybe just take us through the high level, like, what has your career journey been like? And then just, curious to learn, how did you go from the one move to the next? What was your decision making? It's a bit of a big question, but we'd love if you could just take us through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I did something a couple of years ago, because I suppose I should mention I've always had a coach or a life coach or a mentor, or, I've always had a collection of individuals who are kind of part of the, I say Heather Inc., kind of my part of my board. So making sure that I'm growing my business as an individual. And one of my coaches had this little exercise, which is called your journey map, which is where you think about kind of your career over a period of time, and you think about the highs and lows, and then you think about the characteristics that define those highs and lows, because it makes you make better choices the next time that you choose your move. The choices I made early on in my career, so I would say in my early teens and in my 20s, because I started my first job at the age of 16, was definitely organic. I wouldn't say that there was a lot of thought put into it. It was really just around getting experience and having disposable cash. And so, I did the waitressing thing. I did the, restaurant management thing. And I'd always wanted to be a game ranger, actually, but I didn't, for various reasons, I didn't have the opportunity to go to university. And so I was very fortunate in that when I came back from my sort of travels, because I did backpack for a couple of years before I came back to South Africa, I started an temp job, which was for a computer training company. And I was on their switchboard when we still had switchboards. And what was really good is because I was working for a sort of computer training company, I could do the courses. And so I spent a lot of time kind of training on how to do PowerPoint and Office and all of that type of stuff. I was then the EA to a sales director, which I think really helped me think about the sales process and how important it is. And it was back in the day when we used to cold call. So you would literally get a list of numbers and then phone each person to see if they would buy what you were selling. And then I started as the EA to an IT director. So I moved from sales to kind of IT. And again, I got to really broaden my perspective, and I started to buy for him. So he would say, we need 20 computers for this client. Can you go out and find them? And so I suddenly realized I was in procurement. And so when I moved to the UK, that was the thing I knew. So that's pretty much where I started. Very quickly, I realized in the UK, I mean, I was young when I moved to the UK. I think I was 23, 24. And I realized that there was back then, it may have changed now, but back then there was an association with age. So if you were young, you couldn't possibly have run a department, or you couldn't possibly, without a qualification, be good at something. And so I had to start from the bottom. So I started at an organization called the Financial Conduct Authority in a very small team. So there were 6 of us. And I think I was fortunate to have a really great boss. He made sure that I did my training. So he put me through the sort of CIPS, so the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. He coached me from a leadership perspective, and that was really helpful. And then from there, I was headhunted by British Telecom. And so I moved, I think it was about 4 years later, I moved to BT, and I was also in their procurement department, and I looked after their financial services spend. So I went from managing a spend portfolio of about 60 million to managing a 250 million spend portfolio. And again, I feel like I was really lucky because my leader was very, very progressive and very inspiring. And so he would take me to all of his negotiations. And one of those suppliers that we were working with was Accenture. And so I actually built a really good relationship with one of the managing directors at Accenture. He was a pre-listing partner, so he was very well connected across Accenture. And when I was looking for my next move, I said to him, what do you think I should be considering? Are there any opportunities I should maybe do? And he said, have you thought of working for us? And after that point, I hadn't. And I would say that was probably the point I'd started being a bit more strategic about what I wanted to do with my career. So I'd said that I wanted more global exposure. I wanted more international travel. I wanted to buy something different, because up until that point, I'd always focused on professional services or outsourcing, or, I wanted to try something different. And so when he had the conversation with me, he was like, well, it's service provider. You've always been customer. It would be solution design, because you won't be, buying products. You'll be designing products and services that people will buy. And so the role felt very interesting. And so I said yes. And I spent 10 years at Accenture navigating different roles. And then I would say I found my home in transformation. And transformation is what used to really light me up, bringing lots of different countries together to help change the way that a company did business was very interesting for me. And again, I'd learned through those 10 years that actually I get bored. So the reason that transformation really worked for me is because it was like a 12 to 18 month transformation piece of work, and then I could move on. I could do something different. And I'd always avoided consulting because I felt like I wasn't a consultant. I felt like I wasn't particularly polished. The consultants that we had in our business were always, very polished, very well presented, always felt like they knew what they wanted to say. And also it was more about telling people what to do rather than doing it for them, which, wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to get involved in. But then I bumped into an old Accenture colleague in an airport, and we got chatting, and she said to me, you should come and work for us. Like, I think you'd really enjoy trying it. And so then I moved from Accenture to KPMG. Well, so a little segue is that His Majesty the King, he was the Prince of Wales at the time, sort of made an announcement, he was going to create this organization. And what was really lovely is because of the breadth of my experience, when our global CEO asked for someone in the UK who could do it, my boss was like, there's only 2 people, it's Heather or Tim, and Tim was busy. So I got the gig. And that was, it was really fun, and it was really, really challenging, and I grew so much in that role. And then I decided I was going to move back to South Africa, and yeah, EY, offered me the head of strategy role, which was an incredibly exciting role. And that's how, and again, I did that through connections. So at the SMI, I worked very closely with both EY and Deloitte and PwC, because all four of us were sort of involved in helping him shape the vision. And I was really impressed with the kind of narrative that EY had in the market around sustainability. And so when I started looking for a role in South Africa, I said to a colleague of mine, I was like, is there anyone that you can connect me to in South Africa? And she said, absolutely. She connected me into the head of strategy, and that's basically how that conversation continued.
So often if you speak to someone that's a partner in a consultancy or managing director, often it's been a very, I don't call it a linear path, but started early in the company, stayed there forever basically, and ended up in a very senior role. Well, where it sounds like your path, and I'd love to hear your reflection on this, was very internally driven based on what you wanted to learn and what you wanted to kind of take on next.
Firstly, I think corporate systems are designed to make you think that you have no options. So, I think that the systems that we find ourselves in, they dictate that linear progression, and often I think they are very prescriptive in, like, if you don't, especially for women, if you don't get to a certain level before you have kids, then you won't make it, and if you don't, work really hard, then these opportunities aren't going to be open to you. And if you don't take this really challenging role, then you're not going to get, progression. I think those systems are very, very set. And what happens is that a lot of people think they don't have a choice, or they forget that they have a choice. They feel like they have to say yes. And I think what was great for me is I was always very clear that I always have a choice. Yes, there might be consequences to that choice, but I don't have to say yes to a job that I don't want to do. I don't have to work with people that I don't want to work with. And again, in KPMG, I had a really interesting reflection point where I was working with a partner who wasn't very nice. And everybody was telling me, no, it's just the way he is. It's just the way he is. Like, everybody else just adapts. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to work with him. And, and then I was told, but you've only been on this project for 3 weeks. Like, it's really going to impact your career. And I thought about it, and I was like, you know what? I'm fine with that, because I don't want to work with him. And actually, if it does impact my career at KPMG, then it actually doesn't have anything to say about me. It says something about the system that I've chosen to work in. And so I do think that for me, I've always been really, really clear that I always have a choice, and I can choose to put myself in a situation that challenges me and makes me uncomfortable and is a huge learning for me, or I can choose to not.
It also seems that there's kind of that confidence that whatever you take on, you're gonna, own it, figure it out, do it, and do it well. And I think so many people hesitate to do something quite different from what they've done in the past. And so I'd just love to hear your reflection on that.
I do get imposter syndrome. But again, through my coaching relationship, I realized that actually imposter syndrome turns up for me when I'm not being authentic. So and her name is Victoria, I've given her a name, I know exactly what she looks like, my imposter. And when she shows up, it's because I'm doing something that is not congruent with who I want to be. And then she turns up and gives me lots of doubt. And so now I use her as a guide. So when my imposter shows up, I use it as a guide to ask the question, what do I need to do differently so that she feels more comfortable? I'm either working for the wrong person, or I'm, trying to do the wrong thing, or, I'm finding myself, as I said, being someone that I don't like. So I'm being selfish, or I'm being, too hard on someone, or, so that's kind of how I make sure that I'm true to what I want to be and what I want to do. And, work is such a big part of our life. Like, we spend, 80% of our day, or 60% of our day at work. If you don't enjoy it, then change it. Like, it's it's like there has to be a way. And don't get me wrong, I've had moments where I have not enjoyed my job, but it's either been because I know I'm working towards something that I'm going to enjoy, or it's because it is a trigger for me that something needs to change.
I love that reframing of imposter syndrome, because we so often hear it being spoken about as something that you have to silence, like it's something that's lying to you. You know, when you hear imposter syndrome coming up, you just say, just go away. Like, I have the confidence, I can do this, I've got this. Whereas it sounds like you enter into the conversation actually with that persona. And that's it's a way more empowering conversation to have, because you learn about yourself, you learn what you need to do in this situation, and you can take that forward. So that's gold. Thank you for sharing that. And then I just had a question on where you ended up there, because that's really kind of the reason underlying why I want to do this podcast, because we, as you rightly say, we spend so much time at work. And what I've seen for myself and with friends and colleagues, and also some of the women that I coach, is that if we're not happy at work, and you don't have confidence at work, or you're just in a really bad state, then that plays out in your personal life, and vice versa, and it can become such a snowball effect. How do you differentiate between when it's a moment of growth for you, perhaps in a specific relationship or situation, and when it's a situation that is just not going to fit or work in any shape or form, and you have to actually step away from it? How do you differentiate those?
Oh, it's a great question. And I suppose, how I would answer it is that you have to play with it, So historically, and again, I've learned this through sort of self-growth and coaching and things like that. So I used to be very black and white, and it was either, it was working or it wasn't, and historically I would, if a relationship at work, I would tell quite quickly whether a relationship at work was going to work or not. And then I would be quite ruthless about, okay, I'm not working with that person again. And I suppose when I got to, I want to say my sort of late 30s, early 40s, I started talking to my coach about sort of wanting to change some of that, because historically I hadn't really built deep relationships at work. Although I'd built relationships, they weren't sort of intimate relationships. And so I was like, I actually want to play with building intimate relationships at work. And I always remember, again, I was at KPMG and I had this incredible colleague, and I'd met him before I joined, and I was, I was inspired to learn from him. But I was finding it very difficult to work with him. And I was on that line of, and I said to my coach, I'm at that point where I'm actually not going to work with him again. And she said to me, okay, so do you want to do anything differently before you make that decision? And I said, at this time, I'm actually going to tell him. So before, I would just cut them out and never speak to them again. Whereas this time I was like, no, I actually want to give him the feedback and give him the opportunity to respond differently. And it was really interesting because he had no idea that's how I felt. It was a really positive conversation. And we're now really close friends because he understood how I saw that. And so that kind of challenged my belief of like just cutting people out. I think I give it three goes now, because I used to work a lot harder at it, and I would try many things. But now I kind of give it 3 goes. And if it's still not kind of sitting with me well, then I call it and I say, actually, maybe this isn't meant for me. For me, life is too short. Like, life is too short to work with people that don't get me, that don't want to work with me. And so I think through the experience, what I've learned is that if something's not working, then it's probably not me as an individual. And I think early on in my career, I would have blamed myself. Like, I would have taken it on very personally. Like, I must have done something wrong. I must try something different. Whereas I think with age and experience, I'm actually like, no, this is now a situational challenge. And I can either try and change that situation, or I can take myself out of that situation.
I find it fascinating, this, and it resonates with me as well, this relationship between that security and wanting to create a secure position in life, but also having kind of the guts and the courage to, leave something if it doesn't work and move on. Because I think often people get stuck because of fear and, is it the right thing to move? Am I taking the right step? And you referred a little bit earlier to, how the system kind of creates the reality or the perception that you don't have a choice. Let's say the perception that you don't have a choice. How I'm curious about your reflection now, as in a leadership role. What is it that you say to people? How do you guide people and coach people to find an authentic path in consulting that's not pre-scripted?
I think my guidance would be, when it comes to your career, you have to be selfish. You have to be very clear about what you want, and then you have to ask for it. And I always say, like, if you don't know what your next step or your next 2 steps look like, that's okay if you are consciously making that decision. Because don't get me wrong, there's been times in my career where it's like, you know what, everything else in life is really crazy. So work, I just want to coast. Like, I just want to show up and do the best job I can and go home, because I don't have the mental capacity to do anymore. Like, I'm not striving, I'm just going to show up. And I get that. But if you do want to like progress and grow, I think you have to be very clear about what that looks like. And it doesn't have to be, I want to be senior manager, I want to be a partner. It needs to be the characteristics of that role. I want to lead a team, or you want to be seen as a specialist in this topic, or, I want a job that allows me to travel. It needs to be that kind of descriptor. And then you need to ask for it, and you need to figure out who in your network can help you get there. And, I always say to my team, like, you should have a printout of the role description of your job, whether it's the next job or it's the next 3 jobs. And I'm very evidence-led. So it's how can you build up that evidence that shows that you can operate at that level. But also for my women especially, don't play the 90% rule. The research has showed that, women will look at a job description and they'll say, I can do only 80 things on this list, so I'm not going to go for the job. Whereas men will say, well, I can do 10 things, so let's go for it. So it's like, well, challenge yourself. Play the 60% rule. If you think you can do 60% of the job, you go for it, because even in the rejections, you will learn, and always ask for feedback, always ask, what should I have said? What were you looking for? What should I have done differently? So for me, it's about really intentionality. I think it's like intentionally thinking about what your next role looks like, or your next role. And then you won't go by plan. So I always say, like, I used to get very frustrated with my coach because I would have a plan and then I would miss like 3 or 4 things on my plan, and then I would beat myself up. And she would say, but let's go back to the original vision. You're still on track to that vision. You're just taking a slightly different course to get there.
Yeah, I think, and you said that define and redefine, because I think at each step or through each experience you learn, and that kind of plan that you might be sticking to might not be fully say relevant, but you might have learned and you want to reshape that. I want to ask you, is that what you mean? Because I love this phrase I saw on your LinkedIn profile around authentically successful, that you coach people to be authentically successful. Is it that concept around owning your plan and what is important for you, or what sits for you in that authentically successful?
I've always said that we all have a superpower. We all have a number of superpowers. And for me, the magic of working with other individuals is to identify what their superpowers are and to give them the space to use those superpowers. And so for me, authentically successful is getting the success that you desire in a way that's true to who you are. So I don't want you to get to a point that you feel is successful and say, I wish I'd done it differently. It's about harnessing all of the uniqueness of you, because we each have something different to bring. A lot of my coachees will say, I wish I was. And I was like, yes, we can wish, but that's not, you're kind of describing everything that you're not. And actually we should be able to do it without changing. And I know that a growth mindset is important and change is important, but for me, it's like you should be able to be true to yourself and create success. And if you can't do that here, then it's not about you. It goes back to it's about the here. And maybe the here needs to change because they don't get, the magic that you can bring.
I love that concept of the superpower. Like, what resonated with me from that is that in my career, really understanding my strengths, and I actually did it through that Clifton assessment. I'm a bit obsessed with it. I know, people have mixed feelings about it, but I'm obsessed because I realized that I did things in my career that I was good at, but that and people would say like, oh, Nicolette's so good at bringing the rigor or at that or that. And I would listen to it and it doesn't sound like me or like the me I want to be. Like, I know I can show up like that. But there was then other things like, for example, I'm more on the futuristic, that more visionary, and creative elements of it. But there was no space for that earlier in my career, I felt like, because I was also very safety and security driven and ambitious. And now I'm leaning more into that and I feel so much more like myself. And I think, yeah, that's such an important discovery to make and to be able to articulate that for yourself as well. We haven't actually touched on this yet, and I wanted to hear a little bit about your sabbatical that you took.
So I'm an avid reader, and I read a book a while ago now by Tim Ferriss, and it talks about the 4-hour work week. And the nugget that kind of stuck with me is he said, don't wait for retirement to do the things that you really want to do, because the reality is by the time you get to retirement, you may not be able to. And that really resonated with me. And the sabbatical was something that I thought about for a long time, but I don't think we ever make the time, or sometimes it's such a big expense that I felt like I should be more responsible, like I should buy a house, or I should invest in some training. And when I made the decision to move back to South Africa, I was like, okay, so this is what I'm going to do. When I finish at KPMG, I'm going to take 3 months off and I'm going to travel. Always wanted to do South America, have always dreamed about going to Galapagos. And so I honored that. It was a bit of an experiment because I wanted to see if I missed work. I mean, I wanted to see if there was a point in time where I was like, I really want to go back to work. And there wasn't. Like those 3 months, I enjoyed every moment. I did struggle. So I'd kind of planned duvet days along the day, the trip. So just days where I would do nothing. And I remember I was in Colombia and I'd planned a duvet day and I was in a beautiful Airbnb and I was just watching Netflix and I felt guilty for not, I'm like, you're in Colombia, you're in Bogota, like you should be out doing something. And then I had to stop that little voice in my head and say, no, you plan these duvet days to relax, to recharge, to, tomorrow you'll get out there and climb a mountain and do all of that. But today, so that was an interesting reflection point on my sabbatical. The downtime is so important to actually find and navigate back to your North Star. So actually think about what it is that you want from your life and what is working and what isn't working. And if you never give yourself the headspace by taking time out, then you're always on the treadmill and I do think you're at risk of losing some of yourself because you're not giving yourself the time to do that. It's a really important part of my resilience is to take time out and to be quite boundaried about when I'm at work and when I'm not at work, because if I'm not boundaried, then I just don't do well. Like, I start to get less creative. I start to make bad decisions. And so for me, taking that time out is very important.
What does that look like in the holidays? I get that, and taking that kind of that bigger break. How does that look like day to day for you?
For me, it's, I go to yoga twice a week. Like those, I visit my mom twice a week. Like those are my non-negotiables. And I will say no to meetings if they fall into that slot. Sometimes I try and move it, if it's an urgent client meeting. But generally, I will be quite strict about no. Tuesdays is when I visit my mom, so it's not going to happen. And I think I've done that throughout, because when I worked a 4-day week as well, I was very strict with my Mondays. I very rarely moved my Monday plans for a client, because I think that's the other thing is when I talked about the system, everyone always said to me, oh, but, you have to be flexible for the client. And I was like, well, in my experience, when I said to the clients, I don't work Mondays, they generally honored that. And if I say to the clients, I can't do this meeting because I'm going to be visiting my mom, they generally honor that. So I don't know why we're always so afraid to have those conversations, because our clients are people too. And it's about saying, if you want the best of me, then this is the structure that we need to try and work with.
I love that. And it's not only having the boundary and setting it, but actually keeping it. That's the hard thing. And I think sometimes it's harder ourselves to keep it because we're afraid of what others might think than, getting others to to respect it. But so much that I think we could still discuss, but we're coming to the end of our time. And I wanted to end on a few just rapid fire questions, but before we go there, just wanted to hear if there's any, other reflections that you still wanted to share around career fulfillment, finding joy and happiness in your career, anything that we haven't chatted about yet that you wanted to make sure to share.
I think one of the things that I would like to leave with anyone who watches this podcast, because this is still a journey for me, is that ability to sit and do nothing. I think we live in an environment where there's always external stimulation, whether you are scrolling on, TikTok or, whatever, Instagram, whether you're watching TV. I found myself a couple of years ago sort of always multitasking. I was watching TV and checking my phone, sometimes working. And I think what's really helped me is getting comfortable with doing nothing and just sitting with my thoughts. And I don't meditate. I've tried. I'm a very noisy meditator. But just finding that space to sit with my thoughts has been very helpful. And whether that's, I would say find what works for you. If it's a run, if it's in the shower, if it's listening to music, painting, whatever it is, find a way to get comfortable and to create space for your subconscious to, I always say you have a wise coach in your head, that is one of your characters that you have, and you need to make space to hear them. That the imposter and the critic are always there. They're always there. They're always informing you. And so you need to find space to let that wise counsel come forward and guide you.
You, Heather, I feel spoken to on on that point. I like to watch something while I'm working, while I'm on Instagram. So I take that point. I think that's very valuable advice for all of us. So if you're ready, we can go to the last 5 questions. So first one, if you didn't have to work, what would you be doing with your time?
I've always said I would be working with children. Kids that are disadvantaged, whether that's because of neurodiversity, whether that's because of disability, kids who think different, and just help them think about the strategies as they grow up that they need.
Second one, if you had to choose one of your past jobs for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
I mean, I loved working at Disney. It was like my best job. Yeah, so when I was at Accenture, I had a stint where I was helping the head of procurement at Disney kind of relook at their supply chain, and I loved it. It was just one of the best jobs ever. And I have to say, working with His Majesty was also incredible. He's an incredible leader, and it was incredibly humbling having the opportunity to work with him. So yeah, maybe those two.
Okay, third one. If you could get a do-over for one of your career decisions, which one would it be?
It's interesting because there's been projects I wish I'd never said yes to. And the reason I wish I'd never said yes to is because instinctively I knew it wasn't going to go well, because instinctively I had a sort of clash with the leader. So I think one of the things that is very important to me now is working for someone who inspires me. And if I don't, it never goes out, it never works out well for me. So I think if I was going to change something, it was kind of saying no sooner and sticking to my no. Because I think the other thing is I'm easily convinced by something shiny and new. And so if somebody does a great sales pitch, I'm like, yes, I'm in. Whereas I think, sometimes I just need to honor my no.
Love it. Fourth one, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of career advice, what would it be?
Don't take yourself so seriously. I think if I look back and when I earned almost no money, I still managed to make a living and have joy. And now that I'm incredibly privileged and make a decent amount of money, I'm still, privileged and do some joy. So I think, I would definitely tell her, don't overthink it. It's going to be okay.
Awesome. Very, very last one to round us off. And this one is just for you to complete the sentence. When I grow up,
I want to be a naughty aged old age pensioner. I want to still be traveling and having fun. And, I still want people to be saying, oh my gosh, did you really do that? And I'm going to be like, yep.
I love it. That's so authentically successful, like you were explaining, not just be successful and be okay, but also be naughty and just loving the hell out of life. I love that. Thanks so much, Heather, for this conversation. Thank you for forging your path so bravely, courageously, kindly, that we can all learn from you and look up to you, and for sharing so openly and so beautifully in this conversation. I'm very grateful.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.